Wow, thank you everyone for being here today. I have quite a lot of slides and I'm going to keep it to the time because I really want to have a great conversation in here with you all. I'm very excited to be in the Studio platform today. It's very important to me that we started the presentation today with the accessibility features of Studio. I have been working in building accessibility into social VR experiences for many years, and I really love that Studio has this accessibility settings so front and center inside of the application itself. And I can't say enough positive things about Studio actually building accessibility into the social VR experience. Um, my whole career, I guess, in the VR space has been like, let's make sure these features are available in a social VR experience. You know, the same way that we expect a Zoom meeting to be accessible, I want everything that's happening inside of VR to be accessible as well. And so what today's presentation is really to talk about some of the lessons learned from doing a meetup in VR, and also sort of where do we go forward from here. And I definitely feel like this environment and getting to have all of you all here with me in this amphitheater today, I think we're already moving forward in a accessible space for making accessible experiences in social VR. So I run a meetup called Accessibility Virtual Reality. It's meetup.com/A11yVR. That is where we have typically a monthly meetup, but honestly, we've been we've been remiss for probably 6 months, 8 months. We've been on a hiatus, and now we're really coming back. And I'm very happy to be coming back in this space where we have accessibility features. And one of the goals of my meetup was always to use the latest technology and try to encourage feedback, you know, from the users. Actually, like, let's come to a meeting, let's learn from what is accessible and what's not accessible. So I want to put that out there to our group who is here with us today. We know that we're not like 100% accessible, but we're trying to learn through doing, and we want to encourage you to give us feedback. If you have recommendations on how we can improve the meeting experience, we want to hear from you and get that information. I also just want to plug, here's me in a different outfit. I changed my outfit today to be a little more dolled up for the presentation, but here's Amanda and I took Studio's course, the ICXR, for learning how to make more engaging presentations in VR, and I really appreciated that course as well. My team ended up winning our specific group, and we were really interested in like, how can we make presentations more engaging? I really loved the course because one of the big takeaways as someone who has hosted a lot of meetings in VR, it's like, how can we make more engaging presentations in VR? We don't want it to be the same as Zoom. So hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate a little of that today. My company is called Equal Entry. So again, my name is Thomas Logan. I'm the owner of a consulting company called Equal Entry. On our website, we actually have a specific area for AR, VR, XR. So anything that I talk about today, it's all actually referenced in more detail on our website. And so if there's any topic that I kind of glance over today, you can get much more details by going to the equalentry.com website and selecting from our blog the AR, VR, XR section, and we have a lot more details on everything I'll be talking about today. Three things that I think are really interesting for accessibility. I'm going to show this slide, and then I'm going to play a video for you. But the first three that were really interesting about making an inclusive space in social XR, I think number one is just the avatar creation itself. This was like, just so important. With a lot of people want to actually represent how they are perceived in the real world in a virtual world. And so having an avatar who can be in a wheelchair, or an avatar who can have a hearing aid, an avatar who can have a white cane, any of these, things in the real world that people with disabilities would be using should be available in the virtual world. And this is just like a one big picture item to discuss, is that a lot of social platforms don't allow that type of customization. They don't think about inclusion from the idea of someone having a prosthetic arm, someone using a guide dog. But really, if you're thinking about full inclusion and how people show up in the real world, these are all things that should be available from avatar creation. So that's number one. And number two, and we're actually demonstrating it here today, real-time transcription services. So having captioning, having the ability to communicate what's being spoken via audio into a display of captions is very important for inclusion in a social connection. If someone can't hear what you're saying, the ability to have a text translation of what you're saying available and visible is huge. And so I think, really, again, applauding at Studio for having this feature built in. This is an area where many platforms that have come before at Studio did not have this feature, and really made it very difficult for me as an organizer of trying to do an accessible meetup. I need that feature to have an accessible meetup. So I think this is like really fundamental to social VR accessibility, is to have captioning available. And then the last one would be voice commands for navigation. I'll be probably geeking out a lot in this presentation today, but in a lot of areas, voice control is a great way to get around some of the barriers of being able to use two hands and or like fully control these devices that we work with. So most of us here today are probably using a Quest 2 or Quest 3. With the hand controllers themselves, there's many different buttons. There's the thumbstick, there's two different buttons that are raised, and there's a recessed button on the right hand and left hand. All of that is complicated and sort of new design patterns, and voice commands actually give people more of a semantic way to use virtual reality. And so I think that's another big big picture requirement, is to think about how can you enable voice commands in your experiences so that people don't have to necessarily know how to use the hand controllers as elegantly. And we'll show examples. Okay, I'm going to play you all a short video, and I just want to also just show off this cool feature in its studio. So I'm going to play it's about a 2-minute video, but this is a video my company made about 6 things that are pretty important for VR accessibility. I'm going to start that now.
Hey, I'm James Herndon at Equal Entry. According to a PwC report, virtual reality is the largest segment in entertainment and media based on projected global growth. As more companies invest in VR, it's important to keep accessibility in mind from the start. Here are 6 tips to ensure your VR app is accessible. The first tip is to ensure all text shown on the screen is said out loud. This includes menu options and settings. The second tip is to add speech-to-text capabilities. Typing in virtual reality can be tedious. Allowing people to voice what they want to say and convert it into text will be faster. Tip number 3 is to allow users to customize their text, font size, and color preferences. Offering light and dark mode is a good place to start. Ensure both modes are tested for sufficient color contrast. Tip number 4 is to have captions for all spoken dialogue, music, and sounds. Make sure the user knows who is speaking. For music, describe the mood of the music. If there are song lyrics, those need to appear in captions. And describe any sounds, including longer periods of silence. Tip number 5 is to always give people at least 2 ways to communicate. Not everyone wants to speak, and not everyone can hear what other people are saying. Tip number 6 is to give people at least 2 ways to interact with your app. Not everyone can use the controllers. Some apps make it possible to use your hands to interact with the environment. By applying these 6 tips, you can significantly expand the audience for your app. Thanks for doing your part to create accessible virtual reality experiences.
All right, so that's just 6 items, but there's more than 6, as people that work in accessibility know. There's a lot of things to consider, but we kind of put that item together to highlight some of the items we've come across. And I want to go now to really one of my main areas that I have a concern about is this idea of 3D objects that get created in a virtual space. And so a lot of times, and we'll do an interactive demo here, but in the oldest requirements for accessibility, one of the first was this idea of an image. If you use an image on your website, it should have alt text. If someone's blind and they can't see the image on your website, how do you describe that information to someone who can't see the image? So what does VR have, right, to enable that? And I think one of my big uh, positions as someone that cares about accessibility and new technologies is we should at least have the minimum requirements of what we've already had in the past. So in the web, we have a way to label a object. We can say this image has an alt text of this. We really don't have that in spatial media. So the different objects that we use to load in 3D objects do not have a way to add alternative text for someone who's blind. So what we ended up working on, a lot of the work that we did with my company was with Mozilla Hubs, which, rest in peace, Mozilla Hubs is unfortunately now no longer an active social media, social VR platform. But one of the first things was they had this ability to list objects in the room. And on the screen, I'm showing that the way those objects were named would be like reticulum underscore 4C43 and reticulum.io underscore 3007. Really not easy to understand. What does that mean, right? Is the typical joke on the web is if you just hear the file name as a description of the image, you have no idea what it is. So we need to have a way to label things that are used, label the objects that exist in our world. So in this space that we're currently inhabiting, we have different seats, right? And we have a stage, and we have an amphitheater as a whole world. We have an Ed Studio logo. If you look behind you on the back left, you have the Ed Studio logo placed inside of this space. So how do we make that available and inclusive for people that might be coming into this space blind or low vision and they can't necessarily read that? That's one of the core challenges that my company tried to work with and create solutions for. So I worked with Owen Wang, a software engineer from New Zealand, actually. So he was the intern for me, and we came up with a user interface in Mozilla Hubs to label objects. So, for example, I know the pixelation here a little bit. It's difficult to read, but we were labeling an object in the world that was like a black Les Paul guitar with 2 P90 pickups and nickel-plated hardware. Sorry, hardware. Um, we were able to provide a label for the object and then save that into the environment so that someone who is blind could get that information from the object. And here's a very simple example. I'll be using a lot of Japanese examples in today's presentation because I lived in Tokyo for 4 years. So here's this very cute Shiba Inu puppy object that we can download from a site such as Sketchfab. And maybe in our instructional design, we want to use the Shiba Inu for any reason. Well, how do we get the information about the Shiba Inu available to people who are blind or low vision? And so by default, we're showing over here this user interface we had in Mozilla Hubs where we could give it a name and then a type and a description. So the name could be like Shiba, the type was 3D model, and the description was not set yet. But we were really going from this idea of the same way we have on the web. You have the idea of a short name and then a long name. And so what we were trying to enable was developers or authors of experiences to be able to set different values for this information. So in this instance, someone could set name equals Shiba, description equal tan colored fluffy puppy. Someone else though could be like name is dog and description Shiba Inu wearing red collar. This is one of the like canonical challenges of providing this feature is that there's not really a single answer to how an object should be described, but we need to think about why it's being used in a specific experience and then give it a good label. So this idea is that we allow the author of the virtual reality environment to set the name and description, and it's not always going to be the same. And again, another example would be name equal dog, white and tan, Shiba Inu, puppy wearing red collar in seated position. Again, it really depends on how you're using the image in your work, what should be described. And I don't think AI is good at doing this, by the way. So, there's a lot of new ideas of using AI to describe images, but a lot of times I think AI has no understanding of how objects are being used in specific experiences, and the idea of alt text and the accessibility requirement for describing things appropriately for people who are blind and low vision, it really always depends on the context of the experience. Next, I just want to show you that my company built this virtual conference area, and basically we built this model and we ran a user study in New York City with people who are blind and low vision to figure out how could you navigate a virtual environment and then get information from objects in the virtual environment. So we built this like conference room, and then we basically made a convenience store, a Japanese convenience store, where we had different objects that came from a Japanese convenience store. So we had wasabi, spicy nuts. We had this kalbi, which is more like a French fry, like salty food, and then Pocky, which is probably very familiar to some of us in the audience, but Pocky is more of a like chocolate sweet that people would be able to access. And how would you know in virtual reality if you're a person who's blind to pick which objects you wanted to pick up? It's the same way like how would you know in the real world if you go to a grocery store, how's it laid out in the world? And so we worked on a method of providing descriptions, such as the Pocky. The name of the product is Pocky, and then the description was chocolate-coated cookie sticks. It was named after the Japanese onomatopoeia word pokiri, which is supposed to resemble the sound of the snack being cracked. Then we had the price, $2.19, and we had the size, 8 times 3 times 15 centimeters, and we had the weight, 40 grams. So we were trying to explore the idea in virtual reality that you can model the real world in virtual reality, and how much information can you provide to someone who's trying to explore, in a virtual environment, we have all this data. So how would we make that available? As a quick interactive, I'm going to try to spawn these objects, and then I just want to have a little bit of an interactive. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to put over here, oops, I'm putting this is the spicy sort of French fry snack. It's not, sorry, not spicy, but it's more of a salty um, French fry snack. And then I'm going to put a sweet hockey stick here in the middle. Let me try to position that. And then let me spawn one more object. And this one will be a little bit more of them, but a spicy, it's like basically a peanut and rice snack where it's got wasabi and it's spicy. So just to have a quick interactivity here in the audience, if you like a salty like French fry snack, please move over to the salty snack. If you like a sweet chocolate snack, please move to the Pocky. And if you like a spicy, like peanut and rice snack, please move to spicy. And we just want to do a quick interactive here of like, what's your favorite snack, junk food, I guess. Okay, a lot of people going to the Pocky. Oh my gosh, Pocky stock is going up. Anyone picking anything other than Pocky? Yeah, well, I would pick Pocky too, actually. Um, well, oh, Anima wants the spicy wasabi. I like that. Yeah, it's a nice product. That's actually the one that I ate the most. I think living in Japan was the spicy one. But if I pick only one, I'm gonna go the sweet. And Amanda and Peter are over here with the salty French fry
Yes,
sticks.
for salty French fries in any culture.
Well, thank you guys. Yeah, so I wanted just to like show off this idea, right? That this is something I learned in the ICXR course is how can we make a presentation more engaging? And I'm still learning too, but I like being able to have this type of question to the audience. It just lets us be more engaged, and it's different than being in a Zoom, right, where we're just listening to someone present on and on. And so one of the ideas here, though, is like, how would we make that accessible to someone who's blind, right? Like, so if we wanted to run this exercise and be inclusive, people are going to need to know which one is which, right? And like how would you navigate to the right one if you can't see the objects visually on the screen? So I'm going to delete these objects and continue. Okay. Okay. Well, so we'll kind of relate this in here. My question, I built this world with, actually, I didn't build it, but I did a test in a world of like going to a educational class. And I think a lot of us here are educators. So the idea is like you're going to your first day of school and it's in virtual reality. Your first day, what are you going to wear? So number one, um, again, going back to this idea of the avatar, today I put on this like white hat and I put on a tie for you all and some jeans. So I was trying to communicate, I guess, some type of relaxed style, but also a little dressed up. I should have that information available, right, to someone who's blind, like the same way that you can visually see how each of us are dressed here in the room. That's a visual information. Like Amanda's in all black, looking very sleek, right? And Anima has blue hair, and like Sabra is wearing a pink top. That information is all, I think, part of how we want to present ourselves in the VR world. And so, how do we make that information available to people who can't necessarily see it? Um, so that's this question. And another one is, you're going to a class and maybe your first class is English class. How do you know how to get to that space? And so a lot of these virtual environments, including where we are today at Studio, we're here in the amphitheater, but you might have, many different places to go. So we played around with the school layout in Mozilla Hubs and we labeled different rooms. We actually had like, on the screen I'm showing there's a layout of there's a one classroom, a two classroom, three classroom, and then there's these like four is like these different breakout rooms. And so the idea would be like you could label these worlds with like labels such as English room with four tables. So in this particular space, there was four tables you could sit at, and then each table has 8 seats. So again, getting into the digital, what is cool is like you could be like, is the seat occupied? Is someone sitting in the seat? Is the seat open? to sit at. So like, again, I think this is really cool, like this blending of architecture and tech to be like, we can describe all of this for people that might not necessarily be able to see it. We can label these objects and make that inclusive. And this was showing, this was actually Spoke. Mozilla had an editor tool, but this is like, you could actually, like, this is what kind of makes me mad in accessibility is like, well, we have this whole structure when you're building the environment as a creator, you're basically setting up tables and you're setting up groups of chairs. So just, we need to pass through the information so that people who are blind can get that information. And I'm going to keep moving. This was really showing that, like, as you got into a room, there were just every single seat. There's a viewpoint, and this is like how you would position the views. Much like in the amphitheater, all of us are going to be like viewing the stage in the seats. But like, you know, each seat has its own accessibility settings. Then I was saying, like, you know, it was kind of cute. It's more of a like kindergarten, K5, um, maybe primary education, but there's like posters on the wall. If you purposely put a poster on the wall that said reading is a passport to countless adventures, uh, Mary Pope, can't read the last name, it's not accessible to me, but like this idea of this object being in the room, I want all of that to be described and available to the learner. And then here was a how to write, you know, English characters in uppercase and lowercase. That was also in the room. And these are all things that can be put into virtual reality, but how do we express them to people? Another feature, just really throwing you guys a lot of ideas, but there is a way to put a filter in Mozilla Hub so that you could simulate being low vision. And one of the discussion points here is that we don't want to simulate disability and pretend that we understand a person with disabilities experience. This is like a common critique of this type of design. But one thing that is cool is that you can try to use the same world with this very dark, obscured filter and be like, well, what is the experience like? And so I'm more open-minded in the idea that, like, I don't think we should say that this is a substitute of like working with a person with a disability to understand the challenges. But I also think it can help designers and developers understand, oh, this is why I need to have stronger contrast or stronger colors in my environment. Like you turn on this avatar and you start seeing the world through a much more like dimmed view, or you simulate just the idea that this is how other people experience your world. Don't think about your world only as like how you see it. So I think it's an open area. I'd just say it's kind of a bit of a hot button issue in the accessibility world. I do want to say too, we have tons of presentations on our accessibility topics. So if you've liked what I've presented so far, all of our recordings from the A11yVR meetup have been posted to YouTube with accessible captions. So we have a lot of different presentations on, you know, a ton of different ideas in this space. This was us in the very first version of our meetup. We were living in like a very open space. It's very like minimal, and we were trying to figure out how do we get a presenter, captions, and slides to display in virtual reality. And so this is kind of how we started. Like we had blue background and yellow text, and then we would put our slides above it, and we'd have our presenter in the top right. And we basically, this is me, and like my avatar here was like a camouflaged robot avatar. But one of the problems that started happening in this space, and this is just only learned from like living the experience, the avatars would be like blocking the captions. So this is different than the implementation we see in NetStudio now, where in NetStudio you have a caption display box, but in hubs we had to actually display the captions in a specific area, and what ended up happening was like people would stand in front of it. And occasionally those people were like blind, and so they had no idea that they were even standing in front of the captions, but they were making like a bad VR experience for people because people were trying to read the captions. So we learned a lot from just doing, as I mentioned. And so what we ended up doing was starting to use more of an amphitheater like we are in now. So we changed our meetup. I went from this open space to being like, no, let's put it in a presentation environment. And we tried to design the world to make it more visible. Another thing we thought about, which is again is fascinating to me, I've worked in digital accessibility for 20 years. I think physical accessibility, such as like wheelchair ramps, accessible bathrooms, these ideas aren't something I had to think about in tech. But when you go into VR, you start being like, no, you do need to think about the design of your architecture. And so one of the things we did when we were building our world in Mozilla Hubs, we were trying to figure out like, how do we make it so that people can navigate up and down different areas? So much like the room we're in here, we were trying to make it that if you were doing fluid motion and trying to move up and down through spaces, we were working on don't have, like the same way in the real world, you couldn't have a ramp that then goes into a barrier. You have to redesign the space and think about how do you make it easy to navigate. And I think this is very cool that in digital, we can make an inclusive environment based off of the actual architectural design of the space. So what we ended up doing was making this sloped access. So basically to navigate up to get to the different tiers in the viewing space, we made a ramp on both sides that can be navigated up, and then you move up to different levels via using this like double-sided ramp. And so again, I worked with like a pretty cool architect to think of this and design this, but it's like an interesting place. And I am almost at time here. We've got here, Pablo is actually the person that helped me design this. So he's presenting at our meetup. And one of the things too that we did at our meetup was to move the presenter to be more on the top right of the slide. Might be interesting to get your feedback for this world. We kind of came up with it was better for the presenter to be the top right of the slides, and that's what we tried to do. And then we also implemented a feature where you could see your speaker notes in VR. So when you're up there presenting to the audience, you still have the same idea that you have in the real world, where sometimes, we want to have our speaker notes displayed and visible. And so that was, I thought, a pretty cool feature in Mozilla Hubs, that you could be presenting slides and also see your speaker notes while you were presenting. And then lastly, like this piece here, like one of the things in Mozilla Hubs was having the chat feature. And so if you think back to the video we started with at the beginning, it's kind of important to have the ability to have a secondary function to communicate. So if you can't communicate with your voice, you still want to communicate with the people in the room. Mozilla Hubs did have that, where you could have a chat feature and you could be having text-based chat with anyone. So if you, if you're not a non-speaking person, or you're someone that just prefers to communicate via written text, you had a way to still participate in the conversation via chat. And then lastly, I just want to end with the format that is really important for making it accessible is, I think, GLTF. GLTF is the JPEG of 3D, in quotes. But this idea that like objects that get created and spawned in virtual reality, it's really like, how do we add into GLTF the ability to label an object? And so this is just to show you that on the web, you can load a GLB or GLTF format and use alt text to give it a label, but we can't actually do that inside of a VR experience like we are today. I also just want to say again, plug to my website for equalentry.com, but we've done a lot of work. We worked with 3 different developers from India to do implementations for Unity. So we did how to implement multiple locomotion styles, how to add captions, and how to add in-app display settings for color. We basically built like a how-to tutorial in Unity for techie people to actually make their VR experiences more accessible. Closing, I think VR accessibility is crucial, so I thank all of you all for being here today. Let's prioritize accessibility features in VR platforms. With our meetup, we want to celebrate people really doing that, so we do celebrate at Studia for having accessibility features built into their platform. And like, let's also encourage ongoing research. So if you're someone also working in this space and you have a passion on making VR more accessible to people with disabilities, please reach out to me. I would love to connect with you, and you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter at Tech Thomas. Thank you. I think we'll do some Q&A.
So to unmute yourself, just as a reminder, you'll hit the tablet button on the recessed button on your left controller. Open the tablet, and then the mute button is the second one. Do not press push to talk all, otherwise we will all get muted. Instead, if you'd like to just unmute yourself, press mute self if it's blue. If it's white, then you're already unmuted and you can come offline. If you have any questions, feel free to pipe up in VR. And I'm checking my phone for anyone in our Google Meet who'd like to add a question. I'm just checking like under the bridge of my nose, so if I visually look weird, that's why. To see if we have any questions in the Google Meet that we want to add.
I think Karen has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
So I'm struggling to think how someone who's blind would be able to participate in VR they'd have to have the headset on, right?
Right.
But and obviously, but I understand what you were, some of the things that you were saying, but it's very difficult for me to kind of relate to how they would actually experience it.
Yes, I actually cut out a few slides, so apologies for that. But I think one of the ideas, if you're familiar with Second Life, which was really like one of the primary VR experiences, I really took a lot of lessons learned from some research in Second Life as far as how to navigate between spaces. Like, I think one of the most important barriers to overcome is just how do you navigate to, for example, the amphitheater or I think here in our world, like we have, let's see, we have like a few places, right, that we can go to and navigate to. The names of those worlds, as far as like if you just even want to participate in the conversation, first you need to get to the space. So that's like maybe one of the starting points. And I didn't explain it that great with the school example, but I was really like, you need to know, like, if I'm supposed to be in the like English class, how does someone, right? Like, even if it wasn't that you needed to get all these descriptions, you still need to get to the English class to have the conversation. So that's one starting point. And then I think a lot of it is still in the research area of like how people are using VR to teach and communicate. But again, I go back to if the object has no label, it's it's not usable. So I really am starting from this place of let's give labels to every object, allow people to move to those objects, like ask questions about those objects. We have to start there. And then I think there's obviously more to come. But I really do start from the like basics of, well, you need to have some description of the environment.
Mhm.
Great. I see Peter's hand up, and then Steve, you'll be next.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you, Amanda. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, along the same questions here. I really love the idea, and I, like you, Thomas, I've been working a lot in Second Life and now in OpenSim. In fact, what we have tried to do in our environment is to add audio descriptions to spaces within our OpenSim area. And I've always been a bit advocate about we need to have this way of labeling like an alt text in a 3D VR space. So I'm glad we're on the same track on this. But so the question I have then is, I see that you have done that in Mozilla Hubs. In one of the challenges we had in OpenSim or similarly in Second Life is the viewer itself is not screen readable. So even though you may have this labeling and all that, it's not read out. And so how is it implemented in Mozilla Hubs? Unfortunately, I'm sad to hear that it's also closing now.
Yes. So, I mean, good question. This is one of the reasons why my meetup liked doing Mozilla Hubs was that we could kind of hack the web to make it accessible because the web and HTML has much more of a like framework to work with assistive technology. So we were able to use things like aria-label and role attributes on 3D objects in the DOM to make them accessible just without having to build the screen reader. I do think if you're building something directly in Unity or Unreal, at this point you have to sort of build the screen reader or you have to build the assistive technology while you're building your experience. So it's difficult, and that's why we like the web one, was like we could kind of do it, but it still wasn't right, like as elegant as it should be. But that's what I was trying to push forward was, hey, if you're creating JAWS screen reader or NVDA screen reader or VoiceOver on the Mac, can we work with you to make it that when there's a GLTF object, it sets an alt text, right? And then I think just getting the building blocks there is very important to build on top of it. And I think a lot of people, I hate the argument of like, we can't do anything because it's new. I'm more like, let's just do the same thing we had before, at least start from there, and then let's innovate on top of that. So that's my position is coming more from at least have the equivalent of alt text for these objects, and then let's do something more beyond that. Once we have that, we don't even have that.
Thank you for your good work. Really quickly, so now that Mozilla Hubs is ending, where are you guys planning to move to then?
Well, I love it Studio. What do you think? I'm liking it Studio. Like, and I actually like, again, I can't say enough that I do really admire that instead of just saying they're going to work on accessibility, they did work on accessibility. And when you go into accessibility settings, there's 4 settings that you can turn on. And I really think that, at least in my my ethos is like, okay, like let's keep helping support at Studio, like to make the most accessible platform. I always want to support people that are actually doing the work. So that's why I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
And on that note, this was going to be my final note, but this seems like a good moment. So we are still gathering feedback. These are new features for us, and hopefully they won't be our last. We'd like to continue to improve. There's always a new realm of accessibility. So there will be a survey after this meeting that we'll be sending out both to Zoom and to Google Meet and to VR participants. And we'd love for you to fill that out, to give us as much feedback as possible about your experience. You can self-identify if you choose to let us know if you have any differences that did impact your experience today, or you can just give us general feedback. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's had his hand raised, and then we do have a few questions in the chat I'll read out. Go ahead, Steve. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, you're muted.
This is just more
There
of
we
a
go.
response to Karen. Karen, you mentioned how can someone who has a vision impairment use a VR headset, because it seems like it's very vision focused. And I want to point your attention towards a product that Bose made around 2019 called Bose Frames, and they were experimenting with visionless VR. So the entire experience was delivered through the spatial audio in these glasses. It was experimental, and obviously isn't a ton of money to be made in making an accessible platform on experimental technology. But they were able to create, navigational aids, movies, and other experiences that used only audio and the sensors within the glasses.
Oh, wow.
Ooh, very cool. Thank you for sharing that, Steve. That's
Thank
great.
you.
All right, I'm going to read two of the questions from the chat. And then, Sabra, do you have your hand up as well, or is that just a
No.
controller person? Okay, just checking. Thank you. Okay, so the first question is from David. One of the accessibility challenges often found in traditional 2D video conferencing platforms is the use of the chat feature and their interaction with screen reading software for people with a vision impairment. This often results in screen reading software reading out every chat entry, which competes with the actual presenter. How can we manage this in VR environments?
Yes, I think great question and observation. I think this is really more the innovation that needs to happen on the assistive technology side, because it's very brutalist. I think right now it's more like I want to hear a description or I don't want to hear description. It's very like binary, turn it on and off. But if you think about the advances that we can be doing with AI as well, I think we want to have it more smarter, where it's like summarize and or like give me that notification, but don't interrupt the entire presentation speech. And so I think it's sort of the same way that visually, if you were attending my presentation and then you got a text message, you may or may not respond to that. It's like that kind of design needs to be thought about more diligently, where it's not like, oh, every notification gets spoken. There should be something more smart, like I only want a notification and after the fifth one, again, it's difficult. I'm not the expert in that, but I think there's a lot more innovation opportunities there, and not just like brute force read out whatever gets put in the chat. We should improve it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just add, this is just one solution, and I don't know that it's the ultimate solution. We're still testing it out and seeing if it works for people as well. But that's one of the reasons why, when we were talking about the spoken notifications in Ed Studio, you have the ability to enable it, but you have to actually point and click to get it to read it out. That's an individual choice we made. It might not be right for every platform, but we really thought about, in Ed Studio, the majority of the users are using this for soft skills, for conversations and interactions, and the spoken notification, the notifications themselves are usually not critical to your understanding of what's going on and might be more disruptive if they were always read out than if you just have the option. So there are some downsides to that. If you have a mobility impairment or low vision, it might actually be hard for you to click on that, to point your trigger and click there. So that might not work best for you, but for our particular application, that seemed like the best choice the majority of the time. And we'll see what the user feedback is, and then we might end up tweaking it. For another application where the notifications were really critical to understand what was going on, it might have been a different choice.
And I just want to say, like, I think that's still great. So, like, I really make sure you try the feature out and give your feedback, because I do think I'm also really open-minded to that. It makes sense why you made that design decision, and then let's get feedback.
All right, and the last question, I think it's around a very similar topic. I'm going to try and read it out quickly because I know we only have 1 minute left, but from Toby on Google Meet. Thank you for your talk. As an occupational therapist who is a gamer and VR enthusiast, I would love to get involved in this project and making VR more accessible. For low vision, do you think it would be beneficial for having audio reading or descriptions combined with haptics? Obviously, audio readings we have talked about already, but haptics hadn't come up yet. What are your thoughts there, Thomas?
Yes, definitely using haptics. And I think one thing I didn't plug in today's presentation, which I should have, I am pretty happy with Meta there are 9 accessibility checks that Meta published. They're not requirements for people building software for Meta, but they're like recommendations. But that's actually one of the recommendations is if you do any type of information, try to make it visual, auditory, and haptic. So I think that's a great best practice to live by in VR, is that if you can, always communicate through all three channels, because depending on a person's ability, maybe two channels are available, one channel is available. But the more that you create information that's available through all channels, the more that it's inclusive. So yeah, I would just say, yeah, let's evaluate that too. But the more channels you put information through, the more accessible it will be, for sure.
Thank you all for joining. It was wonderful having you today, whether you are here in VR with us or in the Google Meet. We really appreciate your time. You will get an email from Studia afterwards with that survey. And if you could just, I know we all hate surveys, but if you feel able to give us some feedback, we would love to hear from as many voices as possible. So thank you for joining and for your future feedback. We do have additional programming. So if you'd like to learn more about using VR, we have incorporated accessibility into the ICXR program now that Thomas mentioned, as well as a DEI course and other options, and you will get a discount on future EdStudia programs if you fill out that survey, just as a little carrot if the motivation for feedback isn't enough for you. Again, we appreciate your time today. Feel free to log out, and we hope to see you back on EdStudia's campus sometime soon. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.